The message arrived on a Tuesday, and it changed everything. It came through the Deep Space Relay Network, encrypted in the universal diplomatic code that every species in the galaxy recognized, and it was addressed directly to the government of the Terran Commonwealth on Earth. Ambassador Valith Showron of the Thyrixi Dominion had written it herself, and she had chosen every word with great care, the way a hunter chooses the angle of a trap before setting it in the tall grass. The message was simple. The Galactic Concord, a body of more than 4,000 alien species that had governed the galaxy for 10,000 years, was formally inviting humanity to attend a summit at the great station known as Apex Pinnacle. And the purpose of the summit was to discuss what the Concord called integration terms. On the surface it sounded polite, even generous, but anyone who read between the lines could feel the teeth hidden behind the smile. Private chamber aboard her diplomatic cruiser, and watched the stars slide past the viewport. Her forearms folded neatly across her chest, her dark compound eyes reflecting the cold light of distant suns. She was tall, elegant, and patient, the kind of diplomat who could smile at you for 100 years while slowly tightening the chain around your neck. She had studied humans for a long time, and she believed she understood them. They were short-lived creatures, barely reaching a century if they were lucky, and they burned through their little lives with a strange, desperate energy that other species found either fascinating or alarming. They had discovered faster-than-light travel roughly 300 years ago, and had spread across a modest stretch of the galaxy, building colonies and trade routes, and a small but stubborn civilization that refused to join the Concord. That refusal had always annoyed the Concord, the way a loose thread annoys someone who likes everything neat and tidy. Humanity was not powerful enough to be a real threat, but they were independent enough to be an embarrassment. Now the Concord had decided it was time to pull that thread. Valith believed the summit would be easy. Humanity's known fleet numbered about 600 warships, which was a respectable force for a young species, but laughable compared to the Concord's combined navy of over 40,000 vessels. The math was simple, and math did not lie. Or so she thought. On the other side of the galaxy, in a secure underground facility, buried beneath the frozen surface of a moon that did not appear on any public star chart, a man named Elias Wren sat in a dark room, surrounded by screens, and read the same diplomatic message with very different eyes. Wren was the director of Terran intelligence, and he was the kind of man who knew things that would make most people lose sleep for the rest of their lives. He was thin, quiet, and had a bold face that revealed absolutely nothing, like a book with all the pages glued shut. He had intercepted the Concord's message before it even reached Earth's official channels, but that was not what concerned him. What concerned him was the other set of messages, the ones the Concord thought were secret, the ones encrypted in a military cipher that Wren's people had cracked 11 months ago. Those messages told a very different story. High Arbiter Moloch Draven, the supreme commander of the Concord's military council, had positioned 3 full battle groups, 9,000 warships, within striking distance of the summit location, and his orders were clear. If humanity refused the integration terms, those battle groups would move to blockade Earth and every human colony world, cutting off trade, supplies, and communication until humanity had no choice but to surrender. The summit was not a negotiation. It was an ambush. Wren read the intercepted orders twice, then leaned back in his chair and allowed himself a small, cold smile. He had been waiting for this, not with dread, but with the calm patience of a man who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. He opened a secure channel to Admiral Kira Vasquez. Vasquez was the commander of the United Terran Navy's 1st Expeditionary Fleet, and she was everything that Valith would have feared if Valith had ever bothered to look past humanity's small public fleet. Vasquez was 57 years old, with short silver hair and steady dark eyes that had seen combat in 3 different border conflicts, and she carried herself with the quiet weight of someone who had sent people to die, and lived with every single name. She answered the call from the bridge of her flagship, and Ren told her everything, the summit, the trap, Draven's battle groups, all of it. Vasquez listened without interrupting, her face as still as carved stone. A long silence, the kind of silence that fills a room before a storm. "How long do we have?" Vasquez asked. 48 hours, after the summit begins," Ren replied. "Maybe less if Draven gets impatient." "And the council?" "They are debating. Some want to accept the terms and negotiate from inside the system. Some want to refuse and prepare for the worst." Vasquez was quiet again, and Ren could almost hear her thinking, could almost feel the calculations running behind those steady eyes. She was not a woman who spoke carelessly, and when she finally did speak, her words carried the weight of something that had been decided long before this conversation ever took place. "Send the diplomats," she said. "Let them attend the summit. Let them smile and shake hands and do what diplomats do. We will send something too." Ren nodded, because he understood exactly what she meant. The Terran Commonwealth Council agreed to attend the summit. They selected Secretary Lena Okafor to lead the diplomatic team. Okafor was sharp, composed, and had a reputation for staying calm in rooms full of people who wanted to eat her alive, which made her perfect for this particular assignment. A small diplomatic shuttle was prepared. Nothing fancy, nothing threatening, just 5 humans in dark suits heading to a meeting. The Concorde received confirmation of humanity's attendance and was pleased, because everything was going exactly the way they had planned. But deep in the hidden places of Terran space, far beyond the reach of any Concorde sensor probe, in shipyards carved into asteroids and buried inside hollow moons, and hidden in the hearts of nebulae that no alien eye had ever seen, something was happening that would have made Valith's blood run cold if she had known about it. Lights were coming on in the darkness, thousands of them. Engines that had been silent for years were warming up, kept in standby mode were surging to full power. And crews that had trained in secret for decades were taking their stations with the quiet efficiency of people who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. The largest fleet ever built by any species in the history of the galaxy was waking up, and it was hungry. Admiral Vasquez stood on the bridge of the super dreadnought TCS Defiance, a warship so large that it had its own internal weather system, and she looked out at the tactical display, showing thousands of green icons blinking to life one by one, like stars being born in fast forward. Her executive officer stepped up beside her and said quietly, "Admiral, all fleet elements report ready. 22,000 ships awaiting your order." Vasquez took a slow breath, and for just a moment, something crossed her face that might have been sadness, because she had spent her entire career hoping this day would never come, hoping that the fleet she had helped build in secret would rust in its hidden docks and never fire a single shot. P. But hope was not a strategy, and the galaxy had just forced her hand. C. "Set course for Apex Pinnacle," she said, and her voice was steady and sure, and carried the weight of every human who had ever been told to kneel and had chosen to stand instead. P. Maximum speed. And with that, the Terran Grand Armada began to move, silent, vast, and terrible, and the stars themselves seemed to hold their breath. Apex Pinnacle was the kind of place that was designed to make visitors feel small, and it was very good at its job. The station hung in open space at the intersection of 12 major trade routes, a massive structure of gleaming metal and crystal that stretched across nearly 40 kilometers from end to end. Thousands of ships docked at its ports every day, carrying traders and travelers and diplomats from species that most humans had never even heard of. And at its heart, was the Grand Deliberation Chamber, a room so vast that clouds sometimes formed near its ceiling. This was where the Concord held its most important meetings, and this was where they intended to bring humanity to heel. The Terran diplomatic shuttle arrived on schedule, a tiny vessel compared to the enormous Concord cruisers that flanked the approach corridor. It docked without ceremony at a minor port on the station's lower ring. And when the airlock opened, 5 humans stepped out into the cold, bright light of the docking bay. Secretary Lena Okafor led the way, walking with the calm, unhurried stride of someone who had absolutely nothing to prove. She was a woman of medium height, with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and she wore a simple black suit with no medals, no decorations, no jewelry, nothing that suggested she was anything more than what she appeared to be, a diplomat here to talk. Behind her walked 4 aides, equally plain, equally quiet. A Concord escort was waiting for them, a dozen armored guards from 3 different species, towering over the humans like trees standing over flowers. And they led the Terran delegation through the winding corridors of Apex Pinnacle toward the Grand Deliberation Chamber. Along the way, aliens of every shape and size stopped to stare, some with curiosity, some with pity, and more than a few with open contempt. The humans were small, soft, and seemingly fragile, and to most of the galaxy, they looked like exactly what the Concord said they were, a minor species that had gotten too bold for its own good. Okafor noticed every stare and ignored every single one. The Grand Deliberation Chamber was already full when they arrived. Hundreds of delegates from dozens of species filled the tiered seating that rose on all sides like the walls of an arena. And at the center of the chamber was a raised platform where the speakers stood, surrounded on all sides by beings who were larger, older, and supposedly wiser than any human alive. Ambassador Valith Shoron watched from the Thyrixie delegation's private balcony as the humans took their seats at the small table that had been prepared for them at the lowest level of the chamber. She noticed that Okafor did not look up at the towering walls of alien faces above her, did not show any sign of being impressed or intimidated, and simply sat down and folded her hands as if she were attending a routine meeting back on Earth. Interesting, Violet thought, but ultimately meaningless. Courage without power was just a more dignified form of surrender. The session began with the traditional formalities, greetings, introductions, statements of purpose, and then the Concord laid out its terms. A Velothi trade minister read them aloud in a voice like grinding stone. Full military integration of humanity's armed forces into the Concord command structure. Complete sharing of all weapons technology. Open borders allowing Concord ships unrestricted access to Terran space. Mandatory cultural exchange programs designed to align human civilization with Concord values. And a tithe of 15% of humanity's total industrial output paid annually to the Concord treasury. In exchange, humanity would receive the protection of the Concord's combined military, and the privilege of membership in the galaxy's oldest and most powerful organization. When the trade minister finished, chamber was silent, and every eye turned to the small table at the bottom where the 5 humans sat. Okafor let the silence stretch for a moment, then she leaned forward and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried perfectly through the chamber's acoustics. "Thank you for presenting these terms so clearly," she said. "I have several questions if the Concord will allow them." The Concord allowed them, because they expected the questions of a frightened species looking for any small concession before it surrendered. Okafor asked about the specifics of military integration, who would command human ships, and under what authority. And the Concord's answer was plain. Concord admirals would command all integrated forces, and human officers would serve in subordinate roles. She asked about the cultural exchange programs. What exactly did alignment with Concord values mean in practice? And the answer was equally plain. Human educational systems, media, and public institutions would be gradually restructured to reflect Concord principles. She asked about the tithe, how it would be calculated, who would oversee it, what would happen if humanity could not meet the quota. And the answer was that failure to meet the tithe would result in corrective economic measures, which was a polite way of saying sanctions, blockades, and forced resource extraction. Okafor listened to every answer with the same calm expression, nodding occasionally, making notes on a small data pad, giving nothing away. Behind the scenes, in a secured chamber far from the grand deliberation hall, High Arbiter Moloch Draven watched the proceedings on a private screen and grew impatient. He was a massive reptilian creature, nearly 3 meters tall, with armored scales the color of old iron and eyes like burning amber. And he had not risen to command the Concord's military by being patient with small soft creatures who asked too many questions. Opened a private channel to Valith. "This is taking too long," he growled, his voice like boulders rolling downhill. "They are stalling. I want an answer within 48 hours, or my fleets move." Valith felt a chill run through her thorax. She had always known that Draven was prepared to use force, but hearing him say it so bluntly made the reality of the situation impossible to ignore. "Give them the time," she replied carefully. "If they agree willingly, it will be far easier to manage than a forced submission." 48 hours, Draven repeated, and closed the channel. Back in the chamber, Okafor finished her questions and requested a 24-hour recess to consult with her government on Earth. The Concord granted it with the easy confidence of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to run. The humans returned to their shuttle, and the chamber buzzed with conversation as delegates discussed what they had seen. Most agreed that the humans were simply buying time before their inevitable acceptance, that they were afraid and looking for a way to surrender with dignity. They were wrong. Inside the shuttle, with every counter-surveillance system running at full power, Okafor opened a secure channel to Director Elias Wren. "They want everything," she said, her calm exterior finally cracking just enough to show the steel underneath. "Military control, economic tribute, cultural erasure. This is not integration, Elias. This is conquest with paperwork." "I know," Wren said, his thin face filling the screen, "and it gets worse. Draven has given you 48 hours before he moves his battle groups into blockade position around our worlds." Okafor closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, something had changed. The diplomat was still there, but behind her eyes was something harder. Something that came from a species that had clawed its way up from the mud and the blood and the dark, and had never, not once, accepted that anything in the universe had the right to tell them where they belonged. "Is she ready?" Okafor asked. Wren smiled. It was a thin, cold expression that held no warmth and no humor, only the quiet satisfaction of a man whose longest and most dangerous game was finally reaching its final move. "She has been ready for 100 years, he said. Meanwhile, in her private quarters, Valith could not sleep. She had pulled up every file she could find on human history, not the sanitized summaries that the Concord provided to its diplomats, but the raw, unfiltered records that humans had uploaded to the Galactic Network over the centuries. She read about their wars, and they horrified her, not because of the violence itself, because every species in the galaxy had violence in its past, but because of the scale and the relentlessness and the sheer terrifying efficiency of it all. When humans decided to fight, they did. Simply send armies. They transformed their entire civilizations into engines of war, turning factories and farms and universities and hospitals into components of a single unified machine with one purpose: victory at any cost. She read about something called the Second World War, in which they had built over 300,000 aircraft and nearly 100,000 tanks in less than 5 years. and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Fear. She brought her concerns to Draven, standing before him in his command center aboard his flagship, and she told him what she had found. That humans were not like other species, that their capacity for industrial warfare was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen, that perhaps the Concord should proceed with more caution. Draven looked down at her with those burning amber eyes, and snorted, a sound like a steam vent releasing pressure. "They have 600 ships," he said. "We have 40,000. Worry about the treaty, Ambassador, not your imagination." Valith bowed and left, but the fear did not leave with her. And somewhere in the dark between the stars, growing closer with every passing second, the thing she feared was already on its way. The 48 hours ran out on a silence so thick you could have cut it with a blade. Every seat in the grand deliberation chamber was filled, and hundreds more watched on screens throughout Apex Pinnacle. The air itself seemed to hum with tension, as if the station's walls could feel what was about to happen, even if the people inside could not. High Arbiter Moloch Draven had come in person, and his presence alone changed the energy of the entire room. He stood on the upper platform reserved for the Concord's military leadership, towering over every other being in the chamber, his iron-colored scales catching the light like armor, his amber eyes burning with the absolute certainty of a creature who had never once in his life been told no by anything that lived to repeat the mistake. His 3 battle groups, 9,000 warships, were in position, spread across the approaches to Apex Pinnacle like a net waiting to close, and every captain in that fleet had their orders sealed and ready. Below him, in the pit of the chamber, Secretary Lena Okafor walked to the speaker's platform with the same unhurried calm she had shown since the moment she arrived. Her 4 aides sat behind her at their small table, and if any of them were afraid, they did not show it. The chamber fell silent as Okafor took her place. Draven spoke first, his voice booming through the room like the first crack of thunder before a storm. "The recess is over, human. The Concord has presented its terms fairly and generously, and we have given you time to consider them. Now we require your answer, and I advise you to choose your next words very carefully." Every delegate in the chamber leaned forward. Okafor looked up at Draven, this creature 3 times her size, who commanded enough firepower to turn her entire world to glass. And she did not flinch, did not tremble, did not lower her eyes. She spoke clearly and without. "The Terran Commonwealth respectfully declines the Concord's terms, all of them. We will not integrate our military under Concord command. We will not pay tribute from our industry. We will not open our borders to unrestricted access. And we will not restructure our civilization to match your values. We are, however, open to fair and equal negotiations on terms that respect our sovereignty, at a location and time of our choosing." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds, and then the chamber erupted. Delegates shouted in a dozen languages. Translators struggled to keep up, and the sound hit the walls and bounced back in a wave of noise that made the floor vibrate. Some were outraged, some were shocked, and a very few, looked at the small human woman at the center of the storm, with something that might have been respect. Draven did not shout. He did not need to. He simply raised one massive clawed hand, and the chamber fell. Silent again, because when the High Arbiter commanded silence, silence obeyed. "You have made your choice," he said, and his voice was cold now, cold and final, like the sound of a door slamming shut on the last room in the world. "And you will live with the consequences." He turned to his military aide and gave the order without hesitation. "Signal the fleet. Begin the blockade. No human vessel enters or leaves Concord space from this moment forward." Officers moved to comply. Communications channels opened, and across the dark spaces around Apex Pinnacle, 9,000 warships began powering up their weapons and locking their targeting systems onto the tiny diplomatic shuttle docked at the station's lower ring. And then the alarms started. Not one alarm, all of them. Every warning system on Apex Pinnacle screamed to life at the same moment. A cascading howl of sirens and flashing lights that turned the Grand Deliberation Chamber into a storm of red. Every tactical screen in the chamber switched automatically to the external sensor feeds, and what they showed made the shouting stop, as if someone had reached into every throat in the room and squeezed. Ships were arriving at the edge of the system, not 1 or 2 or 10 or 100, but thousands upon thousands, dropping out of faster-than-light travel in a wave that stretched across the sensor display, like a tide of steel rolling in from the void. The numbers climbed so fast that the station's computers struggled to keep count. 500, 1,000, 3,000, 8,000, 12,000, and still more kept coming, more and more and more, filling the darkness with the light of their engines until the tactical display looked like someone had scattered a galaxy's worth of stars across one small patch of space. Every single ship bore the same markings, the blue and silver of the Terran Commonwealth Navy. A Concord sensor officer stared at his screen with trembling hands and read the count aloud in a voice that cracked halfway through. 22,000 vessels confirmed. Repeat, 22,000. All Terran, all armed, all in battle formation. The chamber went so quiet that you could hear the hum of the station's life support systems. 22,000 warships. Not the 600 that Concord Intelligence had reported, not even close. 22,000 vessels that had been built in secret, in shipyards hidden across 200 uncharted star systems, assembled over the course of a full century by a species that the galaxy had dismissed as small, young, and weak. And they were not small ships. The sensor data showed vessels that dwarfed Concord equivalents, super dreadnoughts the size of cities, carriers that launched clouds of automated drones, electronic warfare platforms that were already flooding Concord communications with static and noise. And at the center of the formation, like the heart of a steel storm, a single flagship so massive that the sensors initially classified it as a small moon, before correcting themselves. The TCS Defiance, Admiral Kira Vasquez's command ship. The broadcast came through on every frequency, every channel, every screen on Apex Pinnacle, and every ship in the system, cutting through the jamming and the static with crystal clarity. And the voice that spoke was calm and steady, and carried not a single trace of fear or anger or bluff. This is Admiral Kira Vasquez of the Terran Commonwealth Navy, commanding the Terran Grand Armada. We are here at the invitation of the Galactic Concord to discuss terms. We have brought our negotiating team. Nobody in the chamber moved. Nobody breathed. Valith stood at the railing of the Thyrixie balcony and stared at the tactical display with her compound eyes wide open, every facet reflecting the sea of blue and silver icons that now surrounded her. Draven's battle groups the way ocean surrounds an island. Her mandibles trembled, and the fear she had felt in her quarters 2 nights ago came back 100 times stronger. Because she had been right. She had been right about everything, and nobody had listened. Draven stood on his platform like a statue carved from iron, his amber eyes fixed on the display. And for the first time in his long and violent life, the High Arbiter of the Concord's military council had nothing to say. His 9,000 ships were now caught between 22,000 enemy vessels, outgunned, outmaneuvered, and completely surrounded. And every tactical officer in his fleet was sending the same panicked message. The human ships were armed with weapons that did not match any known profile, shielded with technology that Concord's sensors could not penetrate, and moving with a coordination and precision that suggested they had been training for this exact moment for a very, very long time. Humans had not just built a fleet. They had built the largest war fleet in the recorded history of the galaxy. And they had done it in absolute secrecy, right under the noses of 4,000 species who thought they knew everything worth knowing. Down in the pit of the chamber, Secretary Okafor stood at the speaker's platform, surrounded by the silence of 1,000 stunned aliens. And she looked up at the tactical display, showing the vast steel wall of the Terran Grand Armada. And then she looked at Draven. And then she looked at the assembled delegates of the Galactic Concord. She straightened her jacket, adjusted her cuffs with the precise, unhurried movements of someone who had all the time in the world, and spoke in a voice that was quiet enough to make every being in the chamber lean forward to hear it. "Now then," she said, "shall we renegotiate?" And in that moment, in the absolute stillness that followed her words, every species in the grand deliberation chamber understood something that would reshape the galaxy forever. They had not been negotiating with a small, frightened species begging for mercy. They had been negotiating with a predator that had been watching them from the tall grass, patient and still and silent, waiting for exactly the right moment to show its teeth. The first hour after the Armada arrived was the longest hour in the history of the Galactic Concord. Nobody fired a shot, but that almost made it worse. The silence between 22,000 human warships and 9,000 Concord vessels was the kind of silence that exists between the flash of lightning and the crack of thunder. A silence so full of potential destruction that it had a weight of its own, pressing down on everyone who could feel it. Across the Concord's vast network of diplomatic channels, panic spread like fire through dry grass. Ambassadors from 100 different species were screaming at each other in 100 different languages, demanding explanations, demanding someone take charge, demanding to know how in the name of every god in the galaxy the humans had built the largest fleet anyone had ever seen without a single intelligence agency in the Concord noticing. Nobody had an answer. Species that had stood beside Draven an hour ago were now scrambling to distance themselves from his blockade. The Velothi Trade Federation withdrew its support first, followed by the Crescent Collective and the Damar Republic. And within 30 minutes, nearly half of Draven's coalition had evaporated like mist in sunlight. Their ambassadors suddenly discovering a deep and passionate commitment to peaceful diplomacy that they had somehow forgotten to mention when they thought humanity was going to be crushed without a fight. Valeth watched the collapse from her balcony in the Grand Deliberation Chamber, and she felt something she had never expected to feel: shame. Not for the Concord's military, which was doing what militaries always did, but for the arrogance that had brought them to this moment, the blind certainty that humanity could be bullied into submission because the numbers were on the Concord's side. The numbers had been a lie, not humanity's lie, but the Concord's own lie, when they looked at 600 patrol ships and decided that was all there was to see, because surely no species that young and that small could be hiding anything more. They had looked at the surface and called it the whole ocean, and now the ocean was staring back at them. Aboard the TCS Defiance, Admiral Kira Vasquez stood at the center of her bridge and watched her tactical display with the quiet focus of a woman who had spent 30 years preparing for this exact moment. The display showed the entire system in 3 dimensions, with Draven's 9,000 ships clustered near Apex Pinnacle like a fist, and her own 22,000 vessels arranged in a perfect sphere around them. Not aggressive, not advancing, just present. A cage of steel and silence that said everything without saying a word. Her executive officer, Commander David Park, stood beside her and monitored the communications chatter from the Concord fleet. Their signals were a mess of confusion and barely controlled fear, with captains demanding orders from commanders who had no orders to give. Because Draven had prepared for a blockade against a helpless enemy, and had absolutely no contingency for being on the wrong side of a 2-to-1 disadvantage. "Their weapons are still powered," Park reported, "but none of them have locked targeting systems. They are afraid to move." Then Vasquez said, "Good," Vasquez said. "Fear keeps people alive. Open a private channel to High Arbiter Draven, encrypted, his ears only. The channel opened, and Vasquez spoke to the most powerful military commander in the galaxy, with the same tone she might use to discuss the weather. High Arbiter, I have no desire to destroy your fleet. That is the truth, and I want you to hear it clearly. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it completely, because what happens next depends entirely on whether or not you believe me. She paused, and the silence on the channel told her that Draven was listening. In the time it would take your ships to charge their primary weapons, every vessel under your command will cease to exist. That is not a threat, High Arbiter. That is a math problem, and I am very good at math. So I am asking you, soldier to soldier, to power down your weapons and stand your fleet down, and let the diplomats do what diplomats are supposed to do. Draven did not respond immediately. He stood on the bridge of his own flagship, the Concorde Dreadnought Iron Will, and stared at the tactical display that showed his fleet surrounded on every axis by ships that his sensors could not fully scan, armed with weapons his analysts could not identify, shielded by technology his engineers could not understand. He was a warrior, and warriors did not retreat. That was the core of who he was, the foundation on which his entire life had been built. But he was also not stupid, and the numbers on his screen were telling him something that his pride did not want to hear. He stayed silent, and the standoff continued. While the fleets watched each other across the void, a different kind of battle was being fought inside Apex Pinnacle. Valeth, acting on her own authority, went to find Secretary Okafor. She found her in the human shuttle's small conference room, drinking something dark and hot from a ceramic cup, looking as calm as if the largest military standoff in galactic history were not happening right outside the hull. "May I speak with you?" Valeth asked, and her voice carried a humility that would have shocked anyone who knew her. Okafor looked at her for a long moment, then gestured to the empty chair across the table. Valeth sat down, folded her forearms, and asked the only question that mattered. "What do you actually want?" Okafor set down her cup and met the alien's compound eyes with a gaze that was tired and honest and utterly without pretense. Why pretense? Exactly what we said from the beginning. Fair terms, equal standing. We do not want to conquer anyone. We do not want to rule the galaxy. We do not want to humiliate the Concorde or destroy its institutions. We want to exist on our own terms, trade with whoever wants to trade, cooperate with whoever wants to cooperate, and be left alone by whoever wants to leave us alone. We want to stand beside you, not beneath you. That is all we have ever wanted. Valeth was quiet for a long time. "Then why the fleet?" she asked. "Why build something so massive if all you want is peace?" Okafor smiled, and it was a sad smile, the kind that belongs to someone who has learned a hard truth about the universe and wishes it were not true. Because no one in this galaxy would have listened to us without it. We asked for fair terms 300 years ago when we first made contact, and we were ignored. We asked again 100 years ago, and we were laughed at. We asked again 50 years ago, and your Concorde sent us an ultimatum, so we stopped asking and started building. Because we learned something that every human learns eventually. The universe does not give you what you deserve. It gives you what you can defend. Valeth felt something shift inside her, a crack in the wall of assumptions she had built over a lifetime of believing that the Concorde was the rightful order of things. She stood up and said, "I will speak to the council. I cannot promise anything, but I will try." And she did. Valeth went before the emergency session of the Concorde Council, and she spoke with a passion and urgency that surprised even herself, arguing that the humans were not the enemy, that Draven's aggression had brought them to the edge of a war that would destroy millions of lives, and that the Concorde had a choice. It could cling to its pride and burn, or it could let go of its pride and survive. Easy argument to make, and many delegates shouted her down. But enough of them listened. Enough of them looked at the tactical display, and saw 22,000 reasons to choose diplomacy over destruction. The vote was close, but it passed. The Concord Council formally overruled Draven's authority and ordered a stand-down of all military forces in the system. Draven received the order on his bridge, and something broke behind his amber eyes. Not his will, not his fury, but something deeper, something that had always told him he was untouchable, that his strength was the final word in any argument. That something cracked like glass, and what leaked through the cracks was a rage so cold and so deep that it did not show on his face at all. He powered down his weapons as ordered, because even he could not defy a full council vote, and his fleet stood down. But the galaxy did not know what happened next. What happened in the private silence of Draven's personal quarters after the stand-down order was given. Director Wren knew, because Wren always knew. But he chose to wait, because the trap only works if the prey believes it is still free. Wren released an intelligence package to the Concord through official channels, and it landed like a bomb. It showed in precise and humiliating detail that Terran intelligence had cracked the Concord's military encryption 11 months ago. That they had been reading every classified message, tracking every fleet movement, and mapping every secret facility for nearly a year. Humanity had not just outbuilt the Concord, it had outthought them, had been living inside their own intelligence network like a ghost, seeing everything and touching nothing, until the moment came to show their hand. The Concord's intelligence chiefs were devastated, and Draven's humiliation was complete. Or so the galaxy believed. On the bridge of the Defiance, Vasquez stood alone after her shift ended, and looked at the display showing 9,000 Concord ships sitting quietly with their weapons cold and their shields down, surrounded by her fleet. Commander Park found her there and asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the Armada first jumped into the system. "Were you ever worried, Admiral?" Vasquez did not look away from the display. "Worried?" she said quietly. "No. Sad, yes. I built this fleet hoping we would never have to show it to anyone. Every ship out there represents a school that was not built, a hospital that was not funded, a park where children did not play. That is the price of safety, Commander, and it is never cheap." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "But if the choice is between a galaxy that respects us and a galaxy that owns us, I will pay that price every single time." Far away, in the dark of his personal quarters aboard the Iron Will, Draven opened a channel so encrypted that even Wren's people would need time to crack it. And he spoke to a face that the story had not yet revealed. "They think this is over," he said, and his voice was a whisper made of poison. "Activate the Purge Protocol." The face on the screen nodded and disappeared, and somewhere deep in the bones of Apex Pinnacle, something ancient and terrible began to wake up. The Purge Protocol was the Concord's oldest and most terrible secret. It had been built into the bones of Apex Pinnacle over 8,000 years ago, during a time when the Concord's founders feared that someday a threat might arise that could not be stopped by fleets or diplomacy alone. A network of hidden weapons platforms embedded deep within the station's structure, connected to fusion charges powerful enough to tear Apex Pinnacle apart and everything within 1,000 kilometers of it. It was meant to be a last resort, a dead man's switch, a way to ensure that if the Concord's heart was ever captured, the enemy would inherit nothing but ash and silence. Nobody alive was supposed to know about it except the sitting High Arbiter, and Draven had carried the knowledge like a blade hidden inside his chest, waiting for the day he might need to use it. That day, he decided, had come. In his mind, the logic was simple and cold. If the Purge Protocol destroyed Apex Pinnacle, it would kill the human diplomats, kill Valeth and the moderate council members who had betrayed him, and kill thousands of Concord delegates. and the resulting outrage would unite the entire galaxy against humanity. The full Concord fleet of 40,000 ships would rally, and even the Terran Grand Armada could not fight the entire galaxy at once. It was a monstrous calculation, but Draven was a monstrous creature, and he had stopped caring about anything except the destruction of the species that had humiliated him. Deep within the station, the Purge Protocol's ancient systems began their activation sequence. Power cells that had been dormant for millennia started charging. Targeting computers that had never been used began running their programs, and fusion charges buried in the station's structural beams armed themselves one by one, like a countdown written in fire. Draven sat in his quarters and watched the activation progress on a hidden display, and he allowed himself a smile. It was the smile of a man who has decided to burn the house down with everyone inside, including himself, because living in a world where he had lost was worse than not living at all. He did not know that 6 months ago, a Terran intelligence operative had found the Purge Protocol. Director Elias Wren had discovered it buried in encrypted files that his cyber warfare teams had pulled from the Concord's most classified archives. At first he had not believed it, because the idea that the Concord would build a self-destruct mechanism into its own capital station seemed insane. But the more his people studied the files, the more certain they became that it was real. Wren had faced a choice: reveal the protocol to the Concord and have it dismantled, or leave it in place and wait. He chose to wait, because Wren understood something about power that most people never learned. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who attacks you openly, but the one who hides behind allies and strikes from the shadows, and the only way to defeat that enemy is to let them step into the light. He needed Draven to reveal himself, and the Purge Protocol was the bait. So Wren had done nothing. He had simply placed his own cyber warfare units inside the station's network, hidden in the code like dormant viruses, and waited for the moment when Draven would reach for his hidden weapon. That moment was now. The activation signal traveled through the station's systems, waking up the ancient weapons one by one. And for exactly 4 seconds the Purge Protocol operated as Draven intended. Then Wren's people struck. It was not dramatic. There were no explosions, no flashing lights, no alarms. It was simply a silence, a sudden absence, as 11 seconds of precision cyber warfare shut down every component of the Purge Protocol simultaneously. Power cells were drained, targeting computers were overwritten with garbage data. Fusion charges were disarmed and locked out, and the activation codes were changed to strings of random noise that would take 1,000 years to crack. 11 seconds. That was how long it took to save Apex Pinnacle and everyone on it. On his hidden display, Draven watched the activation progress stop, then reverse, then disappear entirely. And he understood with a sickening lurch of his stomach that he had been outplayed, not in the last hour, not in the last day, but months ago, by a thin, quiet man in a dark room who had seen this moment coming before Draven himself had decided to make it happen. The door to his quarters opened, and Concord security forces poured in. Not human soldiers, not Terran Marines, but Concord officers led by Ambassador Valis Choron herself, who had been alerted by a carefully timed message from Wren the moment the Purge Protocol was activated and neutralized. Valis looked at Draven. Was no fear in her compound eyes anymore. Only a cold fury that burned brighter than anything the High Arbiter had ever seen. "Malak Draven," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You are under arrest for treason against the Charter of the Galactic Concord, for attempted mass murder of Concord citizens and foreign diplomats, and for the activation of a prohibited weapons system in violation of every law this institution was built to uphold." Draven stared at her, this insectoid diplomat half his size, and for one terrible moment it seemed like he might fight. His claws twitched, his muscles tensed, and the security officers raised their weapons. But the fight had gone out of him. Not the rage, never the rage that would burn until the day he died. But the belief that he could win, that had been taken from him. And without it he was just a very large, very old creature, standing in a very small room with nowhere left to go. Away in restraints, and the most powerful military commander the Concord had ever known passed through the corridors of Apex Pinnacle for the last time, watched by the silent eyes of 1,000 species who had once feared him and now simply stared. It was the most significant arrest in the Concord's 10,000-year history, and it was made not by a fleet or an army, but by a diplomat with 4 arms and the courage to do what was right, when doing nothing would have been so much easier. In the days that followed, the Treaty of Apex Pinnacle was negotiated and signed, and it was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Humanity joined the Galactic Concord, but as a sovereign equal, not a subordinate member. There would be no ties, no forced military integration, no cultural assimilation programs, no open borders. Instead, there would be mutual defense agreements negotiated individually with any species that wished to participate. Fair terms, and a seat on the Concord Council, with the same weight and the same voice as any species that had been a member for 10,000 years. In return, humanity offered something that surprised everyone. They volunteered to share their medical technology, their agricultural science, and their environmental restoration techniques with any Concord species that wanted them, freely and without conditions, not because they had to, but because they chose to, because they wanted the galaxy to know that the fleet was not who they were. It was simply what they had been forced to become. Secretary Okafor and Ambassador Valeth signed the treaty together, standing side by side at the podium of the Grand Deliberation Chamber. And when it was done, Valeth turned to Okafor and asked the question that had been living in her chest since the night she first read about human wars. Did you ever consider that this could have gone wrong? That we might have fought? Might have died? Okafor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of generations. Every single day for the last 100 years, that is why we built the fleet, not because we wanted war, but because we knew that the only way to guarantee peace was to make war unthinkable. Valeth looked at her, this small, soft creature who had stood in a room full of giants and had not blinked. And she understood at last what humanity was. Not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the oldest, not the wisest, but something perhaps more dangerous than all of those things combined. A species that hoped for the best, prepared for the worst, and refused with every fiber of its being to let anyone else decide its fate. Admiral Vasquez gave the order to return home on the 3rd day after the treaty was signed. The Terran Grand Armada, 22,000 warships, the mightiest force the galaxy had ever known, turned as one and began its journey. Journey back to Terran space, and every species on Apex Pinnacle watched them go. Watch the engines flare to life in perfect unison. Watch the formations tighten with mechanical precision. Watch the vast steel tide recede into the darkness between the stars. They moved in silence, because they had said everything they needed to say. On the observation deck of Apex Pinnacle, Ambassador Valeth stood at the viewport and watched the last lights of the Armada fade into the void. The stars returned to their normal, quiet brightness, and the space that had been filled with the largest fleet in history was empty again, as if nothing had ever been there at all. A young Therixiade approached her and stood beside her at the glass. "Ambassador," the young one said, "what are humans, really?" Valeth was quiet for a very long time, watching the stars, thinking of ships and treaties, and a woman who drank hot dark liquid from a ceramic cup, while the galaxy held its breath around her. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and full of something that might have been wonder. They are what happens when a species is afraid of the dark, and instead of hiding from it, they set the entire universe on fire so they can see. The young aide was silent, not because there was nothing left to say, but because some answers are so complete that any additional words would only make them smaller. And across the galaxy, in 1,000 languages, on 1,000 worlds, carried by traders and travelers and diplomats who had been there to see it with their own eyes, the word spread. Not as a warning exactly, and not as a threat, but as something more fundamental, a new truth, woven into the fabric of galactic civilization that would endure for as long as there were stars to navigate by. Do not threaten the humans. They do not bluff.